Hi, it's Mark Bernard here with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence, and I'm here today to talk to you about an important topic. We're going to be talking about what are risk treatment plans and what are risk registries, because risk registries are really abused a lot these days because people don't simply understand what risk treatment plans are and they don't use them properly. So neither document gets used properly in many cases. So I wanted to provide a video on and try and explain the difference between the two so that you understand, so that you can make sure that you implement your risk management process in the proper way. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe so that you're always reminded of any updates. When I upload this file, for instance, people will be reminded. And and share it. Please go ahead and share this material. It's on my YouTube channel. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start talking about assets. So there are 6 assets. So there are people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. Pardon me. And facilities are required in order to deliver products. Well, all of these assets are actually. So we have assets, and then we have this backbone here that's linked to product or services. And under COSO Enterprise Risk Management, there are 5 risk areas: financial risk, strategic risk, hazard risk, compliance risk, and operational risk. And these risks are always associated with any product or service that you deliver. And so are these assets. So every financial department has people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. The same with the strategic management team. It's made up of people, very smart people. They have information, of course, about the organization, and they probably use software, hardware, and telecommunications, and they probably work in an office, right? So that's facilities. The same goes with compliance. Compliance is usually dealt with by the general counsel or the legal team, and for sure they're in the office and they have people working for them, and they use information all the time. It's in hard copy or digital format, and they also use software, hardware, and telecommunications to work on these products. And from an operation perspective, of course, the delivery of the products and service, or the manufacturing of products and services, need to go through the operational team. And of course, they require people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. So needless to say, we're talking about the risk universe here. So in the risk universe, we have the COSO Enterprise Risk Management top 5 risks that we need to deal with. And then we have the products and services, and we have all the assets. Plus, there are suppliers. Of course, there's lots of companies who outsource different processes in order to control costs more efficiently. And of course, suppliers have people, information, software, hardware, and telecommunications, and facilities. And there may be many suppliers. It could be suppliers for finance. There could be suppliers to the general counsel or the compliance team. There could also be suppliers, and there's probably a lot of suppliers providing support for operations, for all the technology that they use. This in itself is what we call the risk universe. So this is a helpful way to explain all the different risks that affect your organization, regardless of if you're in the commercial business or if you're in government. Everyone has these risks. Okay, now we're going to just switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to drill down a little bit into operations so that you understand the compliance, the hazard, and the operational risks. So this is what we call a cloud stack, actually, but it's a technology stack that could be in the cloud, or it could be in your infrastructure. It could be right in your desktop or your laptop that you have in your possession right now that you're working on. Okay, so you have an infrastructure, you have peripheral devices, you might have printers and stuff attached, you might have firewalls, antivirus, telecommunications for sure in order to connect to the internet. This is all managed through your platform and or infrastructure. And then, so that's called infrastructure as a service. Platform as a service is the middle layer. And this is where you provide a lot of the tools that you need to run your enterprise systems. So you have to have a data warehouse. You have to have security. You probably have some kind of utilities. You might have Toad if you're running Oracle. You have SQL or MySQL. You have Zoom.net These are compilers.net and like C#, those types of things. They all sit on top of your infrastructure, on top of your operating system. And of course, you have an operating system that requires patching on a regular basis. And so do all these tools. In fact, everything needs to be patched to keep up to date so that you don't have any security vulnerabilities. And then, so that's platform as a service. And then on top of that is the really important part, because this is the business systems, if you like. So this is where we have the enterprise resource planning system. So like SAP, HANA Heck, or maybe it's SAP R3 or 4. It could be Oracle, it could be BPIX. There's a lot of different ones. JD Edwards, so many different ERP systems out there, right? They help you to manage your finances, and they help you to manage your inventories, and all the distribution and stuff all go into those systems. Now, these ERP systems need to be patched as well. And of course, there's customizations on top of that. So this is where you might have software as a service. You might be actually leasing a piece of software from somebody that runs on your cloud, for instance. And the cloud, of course, would take care of the infrastructure part. So a lot of people have realized the cost savings and migrated their infrastructure and their service into the cloud. And when they do that, that means that they don't have to worry about taking care of the servers or worrying about the physical security around the servers, that type of stuff. Somebody else is going to do that for you. But those risks are still there. And those, if a server gets breached, whether it's in the cloud or on your premise, they're always going to come back to you and ask you questions, because you can never you can never outsource risk. It's always part of your business. Okay, so this is the technology stack, and it's divided up like we would for a cloud environment, because so many people have clouds these days. Now, let's look at the devices. Let's drill down even a little bit farther on the devices. So although I'm showing a desktop device here, the same thing applies for tablets, for smartphones, for laptops. They all have the same kind of infrastructure design, okay? So they have they have a motherboard that takes care of the infrastructure part if it's a device, like a laptop. It has all these sorts of things. It has telecommunications on that motherboard. It has attachments for peripheral devices. It needs to be patched once in a while too. And there may be switches, but probably not. Switches are probably external. This is something that you would see in a data center, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then it has an operating system. Of course, you might be running Windows, which is a very popular operating system, or you might be running Apple, which is another one. And then there's machine code, patches, etc., so forth. Now, what I wanted to show you is all the vulnerabilities. There are thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities. And if a company's very smart, they've been patching their vulnerabilities on a regular basis, so they're all caught up. They don't have any exposures. Unlike the people at Equifax a few years ago who had a patch for one of these vulnerabilities but didn't apply it. And within like a month or two, they were hacked. So that hack cost them, they make a lot of money, mind you, but it cost them $760 million, which would send most companies into Chapter 11 and bankruptcy. So keeping your system patched, no matter how big or small you are, is just smart, right? Now you can see all of these different types of software products. So I just took a small sampling: Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, McAfee, Symantec, WebSense, Alien Vault. So some of these are security tools. So McAfee, Symantec, and WebSense and Alien Vault are all security tools. So they also need to be patched, and they have exploits that have been created. Now, what is an exploit? So you see Microsoft here, it says 184 exploits. So they have over 3,400 vulnerabilities. Somebody's taken 184 of them, and they've written code for it, and then they published it on the internet so that anyone can download it from the exploit database. And what that means is that somebody with almost zero knowledge of technology, like they don't have system engineering skills, they don't have software engineering skills, but they know how to download things and click on the pretty little button that says click here and then execute it. And that can get them into so much trouble, but they have no idea because they're not sure what they're doing, to be honest with you. There's other tools here. You can see Splunk, VMware, IBM, Microsoft, Apple, Linux, HP, IBM, Cisco, and the list goes on. So there's lots of vulnerabilities and there's lots of exploit code out there. So this is why we patch our system. So you're starting to get a feeling for the kind of operational risks that we have. And of course, if we have operational risks, that could also lead to hazards for our employees. And it could also lead to compliance issues. So we could have compliance risks exposed here because of these vulnerabilities. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so here is an infrastructure. So you can see on the solid lines on the outside of this object here, this is our infrastructure. That's a solid parameter. And we have a demilitarized zone here. So we have two firewalls, one here between the internet and our crown jewels, which are our servers in our cloud, right? And that's to help protect it. But here in the DMZ, we have some other things going on. So we have a honeypot to collect intelligence. This is usually a server that's been installed just like our servers, our regular servers, and there's some dummy data been put on there, but none of the patches maybe have been fixed. So we're hoping that somebody can break through the firewall, hack our honeypot, and then leave some information trail for us so we can learn about new techniques and that they're applying so that we can harden our systems even further. Now, there's also segmentation in here. So you see the perforations with other firewalls. So these are like access control lists that block people from going into this segmentation unless you're from sales. If you're sales, you're authorized. If you're in finance, you're authorized to this one, and so forth. If you're privileged users, you get access directly into the data center. These are routers that route data, and these little red stars are taps, and they send, or collectors, and they send information back to a security tool that we use. It's called a security event and incident management system. And what it allows us to do is to monitor sort of the baseline of the network. And if anything looks unusual, it'll spike up, and then one of the security analysts will go and investigate that. Okay. And then, of course, outside of our nice solid wall, we have the internet, and we do have other people connecting to us through the internet. So we have customers connecting to our website, we have suppliers connecting to our website, and we have remote users going through our firewalls in order to get inside. So there's a lot of different angles. Apps, of course, are the big concern these days because they have APIs, advanced program interfaces, and some of those things are not secure. So people are checking those and making sure that everything's okay and tickety-boo. So that's how a network would look for an ordinary organization, a typical organization, shall I say. And then we have the supply chain risk. So this is really important because we have some components or raw materials that get collected, and those get used to manufacture and assemble some kind of a product. And then that product gets sold, and then it goes to a distribution center, and then the distribution center sends the product out. So they do this thing. This is called a cross dock. This is a warehouse. So in the cross dock, first of all, the tractor trailer might bring a load of goods from the manufacturer, send them to the warehouse. The warehouse sends them out on separate trucks to the cross dock. And the cross dock is where the trucks get unloaded and their pallets get organized and then reloaded back onto the trucks so that they can go into different areas. So this may be based on geography or geographic location, or maybe a different district within a city. That's how these things get shipped out. And then finally it gets to the consumer, because after the consumer buys it, it lands through either a courier truck or some other means, maybe in the mail, in their house. Now, in the early stages here, you can see that there's, raw materials are being shipped through containers, shipped on trains, and shipped in tractor trailers or transports. And of course, that makes them vulnerable, right? So at any point in this process, any of these raw materials or components to the products could be tampered with. And then when the assembly goes on, you don't know about it. And then you sell it to a customer, and all of a sudden they get hacked because somebody has a back door. Now, this has happened in a couple of places. Supply chain has been a big risk for us. So you might remember the McAfee hack, where a third party had learned how to hack. There's a part of their anti-malware software that scans the system to make sure that it's secure and downloads patches when it needs to. Okay, so they learned how to hack into that from over here, not from the consumer side, but from over here, from back end. And then they used that knowledge to search the database of the government, because it was McAfee loaded on the government systems, to find classified information and then to pull it back, because the patching system not only searches for gaps and installs stuff, but it can also pull back stuff. And that's what they did. Wow. So that was a big hack. And then more recently is SolarWinds, where somebody learned how to hack into the SolarWinds tool from, again, the back end, not the front end, and again, exfiltrate some data. So supply chain is a big area of risk, and companies are trying to treat that risk. It's very important. It's kind of like the cloud technology, all very important. These all have to do with operations, mostly. All right. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about the risk management. So we've talked about risk quite a bit already. So you got a good handle on risk now, okay, that we're looking at least from an operational, hazard, and compliance perspective, right? Now, I didn't go into a lot of details about legal obligations and compliances, because that's almost like a completely separate discussion all by itself. And I think I already have some videos on the website that talk about the legal registry and what goes in that. So you might want to take a look at that. But if you have questions, of course, drop them in the bottom here of this presentation, and I'll get them and I'll respond to them, okay? Or you can contact me directly, because my contact information is on my website. It's also at the end of this presentation. Okay, so this is a waterfall risk assessment approach. This is very popular for many, many years. It works. It's very good. Let me explain a little bit of it, okay? So we start out with a scoping statement. So when we're asked to do a risk assessment, we don't just do a risk assessment of the whole organization. We try to focus on the different areas within the organization. And so that's what scoping is about. So if someone says we need a risk assessment done of the finance department, for instance, then we go and we do a risk assessment of the finance department. Or if they say, let's do one of IT, then we go and do a risk assessment of IT. So we can focus on this specific area. What we'll do is we'll get the scope statement defined, and then we'll go look at the assets that are connected in there. So if some of the information assets, are connected to other systems, then we might expand the scope a little bit. So there's an opportunity to go back here and say, okay, we found some more assets. We need to expand that scope, right? So fine. So now we have the assets, we have the scope. Now we're going to look at the assets and determine if there are any vulnerabilities in those assets, because that's really important, as I mentioned before, about the Equifax breach. So we need to find out vulnerabilities. There are vulnerability scanners out there. There's actually quite a few now that will scan what we call the IP block. Now, the IP block is kind of, to your organization, it's kind of like zip codes in your neighborhood, if you like. So if you live in a particular community or something, the zip codes are supposed to direct mail directly to your house. And or you might have postal codes, and postal codes do the same sort of thing. So they tell the postal service or any couriers or mail service people exactly where you are. So they're very important. And we do vulnerability scanning of those IP blocks of those neighborhoods to determine if there's any particular problem or any exposure. So we check it against, remember when we were looking at all the CVEs, those common vulnerabilities and exposures. So usually the scanner will look at the CVE database and see if there's any published vulnerabilities, because those are the ones that they develop exploit code against. And then it will flag them so that you can go and fix them, right? And we could go a little bit farther in that and talk about how we do security testing. But again, that's another big discussion that would make this video even longer. So we're going to talk about that later. So scope, assets, vulnerabilities. Then we're going to look at the business impact, right? So the business impact is what happens if a vulnerability gets exploited. What happens to the organization? Do they lose confidentiality? Do we have a privacy breach in our organization? That would be a big problem, because as you know, there's so many different privacy laws now. There's the GDPR in Europe, which has long tentacles, let's say, into other countries. And then you have the Canadian Consumer Protection Act and the California Consumer Protection Act. And there's many other legal obligations that we have to be concerned about to protect personal information of our customers and of our employees. So we want to make sure that that never happens, because that would damage our reputation, right? So that could be a business impact, loss of confidentiality. Loss of integrity refers to the loss of the quality of the data. And the quality of the data can be damaged by a bad process that's been tampered with, or it could be damaged by a failed system that gets recovered and restored and it wipes out data, transaction data or something. So very important. The integrity of data is very important for publishing our financial books, for keeping our accounting accurate, for doing regulatory reporting. So if we have to report to the government on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, then we want to make sure whatever data it is that we have, we're reporting accurately. Because if we make a mistake, there's a good chance that they'll want to come and audit us. And it's not that we don't want to be audited once in a while, but being audited on a regular basis could be counterproductive. It could take people off the shop floor, so we can't get those products or services delivered. So it can be very disruptive. So, and then there's availability. So that's the other one. So the three pillars are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that means that you need to have data available in order to do your business, or do some annual reporting or something. So you need to make sure that that's there. So these are different kinds of business impacts, right, that can happen to you. And then there's threats. So lastly, we're looking at threats that could exploit the vulnerability and get access to the asset, right? So we want to make sure that whatever that threat is, that we identify. Now, there are literally millions of threats out there on the internet. So we're not worried about a million threats. Okay, that's not the problem. We're worried about the threats that have the capability. So we go through a whole threat profiling exercise, which again is another discussion, right? In order to determine, the capability and the motive of those threats, to make sure that we identify the threats that are most likely to try and infiltrate our organization. And once we do that, then we also look at the controls. So management has already made a big investment in cybersecurity and in controls, and we don't want to throw that away and say you've done a bad job, because that would be a bad thing, right? Because management does care. They have a standard of care that they express, and they have fiduciary responsibilities, which means that they have to follow the law. So we want to make sure that they get as much credit as they can for what they've already done. So we look at the controls and we say, okay, can this control be optimized? And if we optimize this control, will it resolve this vulnerability and protect that asset? So that's always a possibility. Implementing brand new controls just right at the get-go is not a good idea. It needs to be reviewed and analyzed carefully to see if it's necessary. And I'll explain why in a minute. Now, once we do that, then we report our findings to the governance committee. And the governance committee is made up of what we call risk owners. So these are usually members of the president or the chief executive's officer team, his first team, all the senior executives. They own portfolios, and within those portfolios, they have responsibility for the assets that are in those portfolios. They have responsibility for the budgets and the resources and the assets. So we want to make sure that they are aware of what the risks are, and they can make a decision about this. So that's what we're asking them for. And we're not going to come empty-handed. We're going to come with some suggestions so that they can make an educated decision on that. And then if they agree, then we're going to move into risk treatment. And that's where we get into the risk treatment plan, not the risk registry. So again, we're going to explain the difference here in a minute. This is a risk treatment plan. Okay? This is what it looks like. It's a list of risks, and across each of these records, we have several different tables. So first of all, we describe the risk, and then we do a calculated, quantifiable risk rating. You can also do qualitative, which is kind of like high, low, medium stoplights, but it's not very effective, to be honest with you, because you can end up with a lot of highs. There's no way to differentiate between one risk and another. So senior management could be spending money on a risk that is not the most significant on their list. Risk management, the governance committee will use the RTP to keep track of how we're doing on the risk management. And they'll ask questions about it. So it's important that when we do our risk assessment, that we provide them with as much risk intelligence as we can so that they can make very educated decisions. And that's what they're going to do next, is they're going to look at the risk, they're going to see the risk rating, and then they're going to decide, do we accept, avoid, or transfer the risk? So accept means they're okay with the way things are going. They don't want to change anything. Okay? Avoid means that they are going to change something. Whatever it is that's causing the risk, if it's a business process or a practice that they're doing that's risky, then they're going to stop doing that. If they accept the risk, that means it's cost of doing business. That's how they usually refer to it. And then there's, of course, treat the risk, which is what we're interested in because we're working on the risk treatment plan. So we want to see some risk get treated here. We're going to make some suggestions about the controls that they implement. These clauses come from ISO 27001, which is like the grandfather of cybersecurity frameworks. It has a management system plus a list of controls. So it's very helpful. Pardon me. And then we're going to have cost of control listed here. Now, not everybody does this, but I do strongly suggest it. The cost of control, I'll explain, allows us to kind of set a number for the investment in the control that we're going to implement because we have a principle in information security and cybersecurity, and that is that the investment in the cybersecurity control should never exceed the value of the asset. So we will take the asset, we'll do some valuation on it, but in this case, we also want to keep track of the costs of the investment that we're making on cybersecurity so that we don't get out of control. So we need to control costs. And then there's residual risk. So it's not reasonable to say that every time we treat a risk in this, that we're going to eliminate the risk completely. If we say this is going to be a 0, and then all of a sudden this risk gets exploited for some reason, then it looks really bad. So there's always usually some kind of a residual risk that's associated after we have completed the risk treatment or made a decision about that. And then you have the risk owner. And I mentioned this before. This is usually the executive who's responsible for the portfolio. They may delegate this responsibility to someone to participate in the risk assessment and the governance committee. But that person has to have some decision-making authority. So it's very important that we keep the ball moving and we don't create a roadblock for ourselves by putting someone on the committee that can't make decisions. So it should be the top manager. On the governance committees that I create, it's almost always, I always work with the president, and I always work with senior management, and I always have the top executives on this committee, and I'm very respectful of their time. So I make sure that our meetings are short, very efficient and effective, and in and out they go, and they make decisions, and we record those in meeting minutes so we have records. Okay, so if this was approved, then the status would be approved. And then over here in this other column you see here, you can see there's some corrective action tickets, action plan ticket. So there's a corrective action, which I'm going to explain at the end of the presentation. We call it a CAPA, corrective action, preventative action. That's what we call it in quality management. It's a quality management thing. Or there may be a service desk ticket that you put in here because a lot of modern cybersecurity programs, they have a service desk management process, and we can put any kind of requirements that we need into the service desk and then assign it to different teams because it could get bounced back and forth between a couple teams before it finally gets resolved. And it's much more efficient than doing a paper process, manual process. Okay, so that's status and comments. And then we're going to move into a different discussion about the risk universe. So before we talked about the 5 main areas, right, that come from COSO, Enterprise, COSO probably, Enterprise Risk Management process, and that is financial, strategic hazard and compliance and operational risks. Okay, and all these risks are involved in delivering this product or service that we have, right? Now we also have suppliers that might provide some kind of skills. So in finance, for instance, maybe we outsource the payroll processing, right? Maybe we outsource the handling of employees, or maybe we have a third party doing some other work for us in finance. The same thing could be said about compliance. Compliance is usually handled by the general counselor, but there could be a compliance manager, compliance director that's not legal counsel. And maybe they have some people also providing, a third party providing support for them. So remember, we talked about the supply chain. So these people are kind of part of the supply chain for us. And so we have to go through some rigor when we onboard them and make sure that they're following the rules and that whatever assets they have are being monitored, and any type of risks that come up, they're treating them. Okay. And the same could happen with the operational risks. Operations probably has a lot of suppliers providing hardware, software. They could provide network cabling. They could provide internet service. There's a lot of the components in the infrastructure. So you talk about the switches, the routers, the load balancers. If you have intrusion prevention system, if you have a high availability network, there could be a lot of different components in there that your team may not be maybe there to support. But if there's a problem, they might have to call in the supplier to come in, provide some kind of service. So these are kind of the things like strategic, financial and strategic risks are very important to the senior manager. Also compliance, because there's a lot of board filings and things of that matter. There's the end of the year, the CFO certification process where they certify the books. So these are all part of the risk universe. But unlike the other risk universe, this one is more for senior management because we're focused more on strategic and financial and compliance risks. The operational and the hazard risks, and even a lot of the compliance risks, are dealt with by the management team who are managing the employees and how we build the products and services and deliver those. So that team is taking care of most of these types of risks. Oh, more suppliers, strategic suppliers and hazard suppliers. And hazard could include things like business continuity or anything that could, endanger our employees. Then we might take some steps and have some kind of a process, and maybe a third party is a part of that process. Okay. Now let's talk about strategic risk for a minute, because and I'm doing this because, again, I'm trying to define the difference between a risk treatment plan and risk registry, because a risk registry is what the executives use and the enterprise risk management team uses in order to deal with the risks that are more long-term and bigger and could impact, the organization in a much different way, right? So one of the things that they look at is the consistency. So they look at strategic goals and objectives. They look at the processes to get to those processes, and they look at the maturity of the process. So they want to be consistent in their approach. And of course, at the opposite end of that is being flexible. So it's one thing to be consistent, but you also want to be flexible. And when you're flexible, you're thinking of doing, more brainstorming. A lot of executive teams have an annual strategic getaway where they go and they go to a cabin somewhere in the woods and lock themselves up, no cell phones, and they just work on brainstorming. What are we going to do for the organization? How did we do this year? How are we looking on our strategic plan? And what are we going to do this year to make things different? So they might look at campaigns or market share. They're going to do some brainstorming. So these two are kind of at opposite poles. And then we have progressive. So that means that we're achieving business benefits. So progressive is, and business benefits are basically revenue streams. So are you hitting your revenue targets to be progressive? And what's the opposite of that? Well, protecting assets. So these two are kind of like, they're like pulling at each other, right? So one's pulling at one end and the other's pulling at the other end. So we want to reach our business benefits. We want to be flexible. We like to be consistent, but a little bit we have to be defensive. So cybersecurity often gets looked at as, people don't want to contact us because they're afraid that we're going to stop the process or put some kind of controls in there that are going to, jeopardize the productivity of the system or the culture or some silly thing like that. And we have to be aware of that, right? So, but they are at opposite ends. So this is very important discussion. If you never looked at it this way before, you need to think about it this way, because these are what enterprise risk are and what they look like, right? These are risks to the organization, not just to operations. Now we have preventative controls that we put in place. So we talked about selecting controls that would protect different assets, right? And guard like the the loss of knowledge from humans or from our databases. Like so we take some kind of preventive action. We make sure that we're going to monitor the compliance with that, right? And then on the opposite end of that, we have adaptive innovation. So innovation, the visualization of where you want to be, that's why we hire the top executives and the top executive team, and even the board of directors for that matter. These people have a lot of experience, and they know what the market is looking like and what it's been like for maybe the last 20 or 30 years, and they know where we need to go. So we need to be one eye on preventative control to make sure nothing bad happens, like a breach of security, but another eye on the adaptive innovation of the organization, making sure we can have those leapfrogging moments. And if you know what leapfrogging is about, it's about, when you have that innovation leapfrog forward. And this is what makes companies rich. It's what makes countries rich, is the more innovation you can do, the higher your GDPR will be, or your, revenue streams. So it's very important. And you can't let the opposite end of this, the control part, interfere with the adaptive innovation. So that's the point here, right? So this is more operational risk and compliance risk and maybe even hazard risk. And this is more free. We want to be free. We don't want to have controls that restrict us, right? Okay, so you have to think about that. And then, of course, we have performance and optimization. So improving our processes, and making them better than they were. We should always be trying to continually improve. We should build feedback loops into everything so that we can continually improve the processes and make them more worthwhile, right? More valuable, maybe more efficient, maybe save money. And also include some new intelligence about what is the latest thing, what's the latest technique, like cloud computing. You know how much money that saved organizations? Like, we're leveling the playing field for a lot of businesses, because businesses that couldn't afford a big infrastructure in a data center are now competing with the people who are migrating those infrastructures into the cloud. So we're all in the cloud and we're competing against each other. So that's like performance optimization, right there. And the opposite of that would be situational awareness. So how aware is your team? And we usually leave this to the marketing team, but anyone on the executive team can be involved in situational awareness. So what is the consciousness of the business domain that we're in? Do we need to make any course corrections? What's the next latest, greatest thing that we're going to jump into to make money for our organization? So we need to be thinking about that. So we have lots of arrows here pulling us in different directions. So what does all this mean to us? Well, we have to look at it this way, okay? So we must maximize our adaptive innovation capability. And that means that we need to pull back on control. So if you're a senior executive inside of an organization or a board of directors, you want people to comply with the law and make sure that we don't have breaches. Absolutely, because that's your fiduciary responsibility. It's the statement of care. But at the same time, you're there to make money. You're not there to build the Fort Knox of cybersecurity companies, okay? So you need to, and the cybersecurity team needs to realize this, because this is where we're going, right? This is our trajectory. If we innovate, we survive, we grow, we expand, we hire more people, more cybersecurity analysts get hired. Maybe we'll get a CISO, who knows, but if we innovate, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing as an organization. Now, that there's also going to be a little bit pull on quality and intelligence, because you know what? Intelligence will help us innovate and become stronger and better. And the more quality we apply, the more efficient our processes are. And also, situational awareness is also even a major factor here, because situational awareness, when it comes to innovation, somebody could come up with the latest, greatest idea. Maybe they were at a conference. Maybe they were talking to some colleagues. Maybe they had a vacation in some remote place and they came up with this brilliant idea, and they came back and they said, you know what, this is our leapfrog moment. We're going to take what we have now and we're going to leap forward and improve our revenue. But that means, again, preventative control and monitoring has to have a limit to it. So, and that might be some bad news for some operational cybersecurity people, but this is the difference. And this is why you don't use a risk registry to record risk treatments. because risk treatments don't belong in the risk registry. Okay, let's look at a different angle yet. Okay. However, this is where the real attention. So the blue, the grayish blue is where we want to be, right? But the red might be where we're at. So we are being pulled hard toward having more regulations and more control over our personal information, the protection of that. It's really pulling on us hard, and it's pulling us away from profitability, to be honest with you, okay? Because there is so much. We can only tolerate so much regulation before we're just, bleeding our profits into the compliance process. And the same thing can be said about situational awareness. So now preventative control. Now situational awareness can work for our innovation, but it can also work for our preventative control. Maybe we can come up with some new ideas, some new techniques, like implementing a management system from ISO 27001 would really help control the cybersecurity program so that it could be manageable in this manner. And from a performance optimization, it is good. We need to be at a certain level of maturity within our organization. But at the same time, what's more important here? So in this case, we're fighting situational awareness is what's going to make us more innovative, and it's going to help our preventative control. So these are the different angles that we look at when we look at strategic risks within the organization. Okay, so let's move on here. Okay, so now this is what a risk registry looks like. This is not a risk treatment plan. In the risk registry, you're going to see we have all the different risks listed. So the strategic, financial, hazard, environmental risks. I only have one screen, so I didn't go down through the whole list. But I just want to explain one set of risks so that you understand. This is innovation risk. So when it comes to strategic risks, there is a risk of innovation. So risk can be plus, they can be positive, or they can be negative. So a lot of times when we deal with the risk treatment plan, we're dealing with some kind of a negative risk, right? Because there's some kind of exposure that we're trying to close or mitigate or eradicate even. However, on the risk registry, these risks never go away. They are always there. And this is what the board of directors and the senior executive team will look at, is the risk registry. And is there a connection between the two? Absolutely. There's a connection between the two. Yes. But they both have different purposes. So the risk registry is not the risk treatment plan, and it shouldn't be used like that. Okay, so we have innovation risk. We have a little indicator here to say it's on track. And then we have an explanation of what that means, right? So what is our goal here? What are we heading for here when it comes to innovation? We might have a brief description of the triggers. So we have 5 different triggers here. So green is good. Yellow is keeping an eye on things. Red, not so good. Orange, much worse. And blue. Blue is like code blue in the hospital. This is when the company is dying because there's something very serious happening and we've got to fix it. Maybe it's a hostile takeover. Maybe we don't have liquidity and we've just had a breach and we need to take care of our reputation. There could be a lot of things that are going on. But each of these triggers will have a definition or an action plan already defined on what it is that we're going to do. And here is the where we load this, right? So we put the different triggers, the blue to green, and we explain what it is that we're going to do. We have an action plan, and that action plan gets approved by the board of directors. So this is the Enterprise Risk Management Risk Registry. These are the triggers, and they're defined here, and we have action plans to back this up. And there are some examples down here. So liability, project risk, competitive risk, innovative risk, all of these things that we talked about already. Okay. Now this is the corrective and preventative action plan. This is a very useful tool. It comes from the quality management world. I'm going to explain 2 parts here on 2 slides, and then I think we're done. So let's take a quick look. So it's affectionately known as the CAPA, Corrective Action Preventative Action Plan. And here's, we put a ticket number. Again, we link it back to if we have a service desk ticket, we put it back to the service desk ticket. If we have an action plan, what kind of action plan is it? So we have corrective actions. So corrective actions are things that we need to take care of today. Okay, they're not going to wait until next week. They need to be fixed now. It's like a breach of security. You could look at it that way. But if it was an enterprise risk, it might be something else, right? And then there's a preventative action. Okay, and preventative action is more long-term. We want to take corrective action to fix it today. This is a Band-Aid solution, but long-term, we're going to take a preventative action. So we might actually have 2 action plans to resolve one risk. It's possible. So we have a longer plan, a bigger plan. Maybe we have a roadmap that's associated with a preventative action plan, and we're going to follow that roadmap. And then there's improvement. So there's always opportunity for improvement. This is, this would be an audit finding, corrective or preventative, but an improvement might not be an audit finding. It might not show up on an audit report. And it might not be a serious item that's on the risk assessment. So it could be something that just we need to improve. Like maybe we have an identity and access management system, but we don't do authentication very good. Maybe it's not encrypted. So we need to make an improvement on that. So we'll say, check this, make an improvement. Who owns it? Title of the risk owner. So the Chief Information Security Officer or the CIO, Chief Information Officer maybe. They're in the IT department. They received this CAPA report on this date. The CAPA, the risk, the corrective or preventative risk that was identified or the opportunity for improvement was identified by this. Usually we don't use names. We put a title in here. So it might have been an auditor. It could have been a cybersecurity risk analyst. And they found it on this date. And it was accepted on the same day, which is bonus. Great. Sometimes there's weeks. So we track those dates because sometimes there's a lag, right? There's an opportunity to improve the process maybe. What are the requirements? So we referenced the control did not comply. So we looked at a specific control and it wasn't working properly. It's a bit of a high risk because it's involved in handling maybe customer information. And the status is open because it's been approved. So, or maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's just been written and it's open and not approved. Covering up these boxes over here. Who executed the risk? That was the internal audit or was the risk assessment person. So it could be the name of a risk assessment person here, risk analyst. Requirements for it, the nonconformity. This says a specific reference back. In this case, it's again back to the ISO 27001 reference. So if you want to know what that control objective is, you could look it up. You could copy it in here, paste it in here. That might help. On the next half of the page, you see a root cause. So we need to do root cause analysis. This is the key to problem management to make it work. So you want to look at what is the root problem with this process, and that will take a little bit of investigation probably. So you don't always know the root cause. Like root cause is not compliance. The system wasn't compliant with the control. There's a reason why it wasn't compliant. So you have to find out what that is, and that needs to go in this box. And then you need to make a corrective action. Now, I recommend that you have, 1 to 6 steps in your corrective action, and each one progressively takes you to the conclusion, a successful conclusion of this. There's no right or wrong number here, but I think the fewer steps you have, like if you have 1 to 6, it's a reasonable amount. As long as you can prove logically that it can get you to where you need to be. So that's the corrective action. And then we have the validation or the verification, which is very important. This needs to be done objectively. So we say objective confirmation. So we don't want the same person who is owner of this risk to be saying that it's done. We want some independence because that improves the integrity of our process. And that's really important with customers. We want a validation date when it was approved, when it was reviewed, who did the approval, and what were the steps that they went through. They might go through the same steps that was used to implement, and they might just check each of those steps and make sure they were completed, for instance. Or they might have a completely different set of tests that they're going to run. All right, so conclusion. The risk universe is unique to your industry and your organization. So the risk universe, I gave you a generic one, but and it could apply to many different organizations, but I just want to give you an idea. Your risk universe includes enterprise risks, such as impact to strategic financial hazard, compliance, operational, planning and execution. Risk assessments are conducted to help evaluate and quantify the exposure of organizational assets to vulnerabilities and threats. The risk treatment plan is a dashboard that management uses to track risk decision-making actions until the risk treatment has been successfully completed, at which point the action plan is closed and the line item is removed from the risk treatment plan. Very important. Now, the enterprise risk management focuses on risks that could prevent the organization from reaching its strategic goals. And we mentioned quite a few there. Okay, so we talked about, the need to innovation, but the need to also comply with regulations, right? And the tugging and the pulling. And if you're in a boardroom discussion or you're with the management, executive management team like I've been, you'll hear the tugging and pulling going on between the discussions in that room. And it's great because that's what they're there for, right? Is they're there to challenge the process and to make it work for the organization. And they're not so much focused on the operational risks. These are things that they expect us as professionals to resolve and to come to them with some intelligence so that they can make the proper decisions, right? So we can make them look great while they focus on the things that are really important by keeping our organization running smoothly. That's what they're there for, okay? So they are focused on reaching strategic and tactical goals such as planning, market growth, market capitalization, keeping the revenue stream healthy. If there's any negative trends, then we need to fix those. And most importantly, innovation. Because innovation is what makes every organization profitable and keeps it going. If you're not innovating, then I'm afraid to say that you're dying, right? The organization is just not, it's failing. So you need to innovate. The Risk Registry is used to track enterprise risks. These risks never go away. There's always going to be risk to innovation, always financial risks, always strategic risks, always. But you need to have trigger points for those. So that's what we do. So these pressures on the organization to some degree, they always are there. The organization creates trigger points and corresponding action points. So it's not like you hit the first trigger and then they all have a meeting at the executive level and say, okay, boy, what do we do now? Like we don't have any plans. No, all these things are all done. These are professionals. These are senior managers. They know they have to have plans, and the executive officer is there and the president to make sure that the team works together to come up with these plans and these triggers, and the board of directors will ask about them, right? So very important to let them do their job and you take care of operational risks and compliance risks. Okay. Generally, the board of directors and executive team focus on strategic and financial risks, while management team focuses on operational compliance and hazard risks. I just said that. Quality management uses a corrective action, preventative action planning document to record root cause of nonconformities that expose the organization to risks. So you could use it for the enterprise risk management process, just like you could the operational. It gets used for operational risks a lot, but in the quality management world, in ISO 9000 and 9001, those frameworks involve the whole organization. So they would include enterprise risk management and certainly strategic planning. So you could use a CAPA for those. So the closure of the CAPA requires objective validation. And that's the end of my presentation. So I hope you found this helpful, because I was really trying to explain the difference between risk treatment planning and risk registries, because there are a lot of people, sadly, that don't know the difference. And I hope that this has helped you to be a better professional and help you apply these techniques and tools in the appropriate way. Because if you do, you're going to look brilliant, first of all, but you'll also have much more success. And the management team will really appreciate it because you're going to provide super guidance to them. You can find me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. It's the Barnard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence. We're young and growing. You can reach me at on the website, or here's my email address or phone number. And please click on the QR code, subscribe, so that you don't miss out on any of my next videos. And like and share Okay, that would be great. Thank you for helping me, and I hope that I helped you. Have yourself a great day, and thank you so much for your time.